Chapter 18. It has been said that many, many moons ago, all the animals and birds of the earth possessed the power of speech. They still do to this day, but only for those among us who still have the ears with which to hear. Christy O'Keefe always prided himself on his uncanny ability to hear the creatures on occasion, and when he did, the often jarring and prescient things they said. Therefore, it did not come as a great surprise to him that, following his illuminating yet troubling conversation with Gwen, and as he had headed back to the ever-faithful VW Westphalia that had remained parked in front of the house, patiently awaiting his return, he should hear from across the street a mourning dove cry out soulfully and say to him, "Lally died, didn't you know, didn't you know, didn't you know?" The dove then repeated the question verbatim 3 more times, and thus prompted Christy to respond defeatedly, "I reckon I should have," as he climbed world-wearily into the driver's seat and rested his elbows on the steering wheel. While placing his head in his hands, he realized, if only in hindsight, that he'd been missing other conspicuous signs of late that had all been saying the same thing. Most notably, a pair of black oyster catchers who had been building a nest on the rocky outcropping at Point Pinos in Pacific Grove had cried out quite shrilly to him only last week as he had sat behind the wheel of the Westphalia at a parking turnout and contemplated the sea. At the sight of Christy, the birds had dropped what they were doing and taken flight. Beating their wings frantically, they had flown swiftly across the water, and all the while chanting until they were out of sight. "Lally died, Lally, Lally, Lally. Lally died, Lally, Lally, Lally." Christy had paid them no heed, for the message they had attempted to convey so ardently had seemed senseless. Lally was, in his mind, after all, young and strong and vivacious. That was how she appeared to him, at least, in his vivid recollections of her. But the fact of the matter was that he hadn't actually seen Natalie in well over 20 years. Christy's first meeting with Natalie had occurred at the Pacific Edge restaurant of the Highlands Inn following his release from the hospital after the whole sneaker wave incident. At Zuzu's request, no mention of his involvement in that incident was ever to be made in Natalie's presence, and she had introduced Christy to her daughter as simply a friend with a property in Big Sur where they might be able to stay for the next 9 months. Zuzu had also requested that for appearance's sake, it would probably be better if Lord Byron was not acknowledged as ever having belonged to Christy in the first place, because she'd already established with Natalie that the dog's owner had perished in the same wicked wave from which Zuzu herself had been miraculously rescued. If Christy O'Keefe was able to summon up the forced patience with which to indulge Zuzu in her somewhat devious reasoning, it must be noted that Lord Byron stood on no such ceremony. No sooner than Christy approached the window table with the dramatic view of the Pacific Ocean churning far below them, a loud thumping noise could be heard to emanate from beneath the table itself, and a shaggy black creature the size of a Shetland pony was seen to excitedly rise to its feet while nearly taking the whole table with it. Needless to say, the reunion between man and dog was full of exuberant joy and, let it be said, an excessive amount of drooling. "Critters tend to like me," was all that Christy offered by way of explanation to an aghast Natalie, who looked on all but stupefied. When it was later explained over dinner to Christy that Natalie planned to stay with her mother during the pregnancy, he immediately made the goat house available to them, as well as offered to get Natalie a job bussing tables at Nepenthe, where he had been working as a dishwasher. The arrangement subsequently worked out rather well for all concerned, given Natalie and Zuzu's extenuating circumstances. It also allowed Christy and Natalie to become better acquainted as they commuted down Highway 1 in the Westphalia together on a regular basis on their way to work. Christy discovered Natalie to be a complex young woman, born as she'd been under the sign of the fish in the Western zodiac, with all the commensurate problems endemic to that sign, the principle of which was the counterproductive tendency to swim in opposite directions at the same time. It was this tendency, no doubt, that accounted for Natalie's savvy ability to solve complicated problems with an unconventional approach. It likewise explained her cool-headedness when faced with her mother's hysterical reaction to an admittedly thorny dilemma, and her willingness to stoically stand by her mother and protect her father at any cost. Natalie's sense of filial piety seemed to have known no bounds. And yet, for all her conservative pragmatism, Christy also found her to be a naive and hopeless romantic, who was drawn to the fanciful and mysterious, open-minded and unafraid of the irrational. It was for this reason Christy always had surmised that Natalie was the only person who had ever believed him when he had spoken out about his encounter with the talking seal. Zuzu told him in no uncertain terms that he'd clearly lost his mind, and thus saw the story as just one more reason to disentangle herself, and as soon as possible, from Christy O'Keefe and the wilder shores of Big Sur forever. Natalie had listened to the story without the blinking of an eye, and afterwards assured Christy, seals talk to people with great frequency in places like Ireland and Scotland, I've heard. Supposedly, it happens a lot in Norway and Iceland, too. And what is it they say? Christy asked, genuinely impressed by Natalie's generosity of spirit. They usually issue warnings, I think. They tell people great harm will come to them if they kill a seal. And do the people ever listen? Christy asked, shaking his head in dismay as if he already knew the answer. Not often, Natalie had to admit. But then the people do die, usually, 1 year to the day on which they killed the seal, if that's any consolation. It ain't, Christy said grimly. But what do you make of my seal? Telling me the great Pan is dead. I don't believe it, Natalie replied confidently. Well, if the seal thinks he died, and he didn't, where is he? Christy asked shrewdly, playing the devil's advocate. He's moved, more than likely, Natalie answered with all the conservative pragmatism that she could muster on the spur of the moment. That's a distinct possibility, Christy acknowledged cagily, not above pretending to mentally calculate the odds of such a thing happening. But, just for the sake of argument, let's say he did. Where do you think he went? Unlike most gods, Pan has always preferred to live on Earth. In Arcadia, actually, Natalie explained matter-of-factly. My guess is he may have been forced to relocate. Well, you've said as much already, my dear, and it's where I'm asking ya, Christy doggedly insisted, apparently trying to corner her, but inwardly quite taken with her astute ability to grasp Pan's situation. And then, without calling us bluff for an instant, Natalie said, to the man with whom seals talked so freely, and upon whom great Newfoundland dogs slobbered with joy so excessively, To Big Sur, of course. Better be careful, Christy thought to himself. Natalie's catching on. Nevertheless, long after he'd lost touch with the girl, it had brought him great happiness to think that somewhere at least there would always be a Natalie Dubois, afoot and light-hearted in this world. At that point, the mourning dove interrupted Christie's reverie with one more soulful proclamation that came from across the street. But this time it was not yet another grim reminder that Natalie had died. This time the dove issued a warning that caught Christie completely off guard. Jean-Noël Coutu, Jean-Noël Coutu, Jean-Noël Coutu, the mourning dove repeated 3 times.